G'day guys, and today we're going to be talking about hate speech, specifically with reference to this article from garnpress.com titled "What is Hate Speech and Why Hate Speech is Not Free Speech?" This was written on May the 1st this very year, 2018, by an individual known as George Lakoff. Yes, I will assume he is male. And it starts, I have been asked what hate speech is. It is not exactly hard to detect. Hate speech defames, belittles, or dehumanizes a class of people on the basis of certain inherent properties, typically race, ethnicity, gender, or religion. Mr. Lakoff goes on to outline some methods of defamation. So he has 4 examples here. He gives each one an example, but he doesn't actually source these examples. So even though we could easily go find this ourselves, it is very improper, I feel, for him to not source his examples, because how can we know that the racist right falsely claims that whites are responsible for all advances in civilization? I'm sure maybe some people believe that, but unless I see some kind of link to a source that says 80% of the racist right, whatever that means, claim that whites are responsible for all advances in civilization. So yeah, no sourcing, pretty typical journalistic fluff stuff. Although he does make one good point. His last one, perhaps the most dangerous form of hate speech comes from the government itself. This will tie into my point later on, but it's interesting that he mentioned this. But it is, of course, entirely partisan how he mentions the president, so referencing Trump, excuses racist violence and supports the oppressive use of government force, I should say. And now, I'm assuming this is referring to Charlottesville. I'm not 100% sure because he doesn't source what exactly he means by excuses racist violence. But President Trump has come out and decried all forms of violence following the Charlottesville protests, for want of a better word. Supporting the use of oppressive government force, large organised crowds of armed demonstrators. That would be Antifa. I'm sure he's not referring to Antifa, but it sounds like Antifa to me. Police who target minorities, again unsourced. ICE trapping undocumented immigrants for deportation, again. How are you supposed to, if you're going to deport people, you can't just let them wander around. You do have to detain them if you're going to deport them. Discriminatory laws that intimidate minorities from voting. Again, source please. Hate speech these days is not just a speech by an individual. It has become an industry for the racist right, organised, purposely provocative, a recruiting tool, and a show of power aiming at greater power. Now again, source please, industry for the racist right. The only sort of industry I see for any racist speak nowadays is the mainstream corporate media, unless you're referring to sort of the dark internet or whatever wacky term they use to describe people like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, who are not in any way racist or far right. Although I would say that purposely provocative is probably true, yeah. At least Senator Fraser Anning's speech was designed to be purposely provocative, but of course speeches are going to be purposely provocative to sort of propagate themselves. Free publicity, so to speak. And now we get to the crux of his argument. Marketed hate speech is not merely by an individual. It is actually physical in nature because all ideas are physically constituted by neural circuitry in our brains. When you are repeatedly told by those protected by the president and his government that you are a lesser being and are hated, again, source please, it can have a crippling effect physically on your brain, mind and heart. Now this claim is actually true. Certain words have been proven to trigger the expression of certain genes in the brain that will create hormones such as stress and happiness, or all kinds of emotions like that, dependent on the word. It's actually very interesting. Hate speech can affect those who are repeated objects of hate with crippling toxic stress and a sense of distrust and fear that can keep those hated from living full and free lives. Mass-marketed hate stands resolutely in the path of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all Americans. Continuing on down a bit, hate speech can be even more severe than an attack with a physical object. It imposes on the freedom to think and therefore act free of fear, threats, and distrust. It imposes on one's ability to think and act like a fully free citizen for a long time. That's why hate speech imposes on the freedom of those targeted by hate. Since being free in a society requires not imposing on the freedom of others, hate speech does not fall under the category of free speech. So I have several points of opposition to this argument. First off, I want to, again, like I like to do, target the language. So we have a very narrative structure, which is often the case with journalistic articles. If we have a look at the next paragraph down, hate speech can also change the brains of those with mild prejudice, moving it towards hate and threatening action, blah, 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 blah. While this could certainly be true, I need a source for this sort of thing. What is the percentage of people who are moved towards hate by being exposed to hate speech? We also should pay close attention to the types of language used surrounding the breadth of time described by the effects of hate speech. So, for example, we have language has a long-term crippling effect, creating toxic stress, fear, and distrust, all physical, all in one's neural circuitry, active every day. The long-term, often crippling effects of physical speech on the neural system, blah, 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 blah. Again, whilst this can certainly be true, if you are routinely harassed every day, this can have long-term crippling effects on your psyche. We see this in childhood victims of sexual abuse, physical abuse within the family, and things like that. But this isn't necessarily the case 100% of the time. It does admit that it isn't crippling all the time, but it said it is often crippling all the time. I do need to see some evidence that this is the case. I can't just accept that language can have a long-term crippling effect on people often or most of the time. I do need to see a source on that. So again, sneaky language designed to narratively position you. The most important sentence, I believe, in this article comes in the fourth paragraph of the second little bit of it, why hate speech is not free speech. Quote, hate speech changes the brains of those hated for the worse, creating toxic stress, fear, and distrust, all physical, in one's neural circuitry, active every day. This, to me, smacks of hedonism. Now, I didn't pick up on it at first, but hedonism, of course, is maximizing pleasure and minimizing displeasure or pain. And this is a part of a larger issue I see with society where people are so adverse and so fixated on avoiding pain, fear, distrust at all costs. We have not attributed the worthy accolades to these emotions. Now, let me try and explain what I mean here. Fear, distrust, stress are all emotions, and like all emotions, they are merely negative feedback loops designed to increase your chance of survival. When you feel fear or stress, for example, this triggers adrenaline secretions which drain the blood from your extremities and increases your heart rate. This is all designed so you can go and fist fight a kangaroo or whatever. Anxiety does much of the same thing. It's all about warning you of danger, real or imagined. For example, if someone was not scared about fist fighting a kangaroo, they would not have the appropriate adrenaline secretions and they'd be, gearing up for fight or flight, and then they might die. They have an increased chance of dying because they're simply lacking physiological responses that someone else might have. And for example, if someone's not anxious, then they're not going to be as sort of paranoid about the surroundings, and they might get eaten by a drop bear, for example. That's why everyone's scared of the dark, because anyone who wasn't scared of the dark back in the day died. So I do want to stress that fear, stress, anxiety, these sorts of emotions, negative emotions, are not necessarily negative, although our society, in its hedonistic manner, has portrayed them this way. Additionally, whilst this article paints the scene of, for example, far-righters shouting down Muslims, this is a very narrow-minded, partisan view of offensive speech. Offensive speech is not merely limited to oppressor and oppressed. Consider difficult conversations with your friends, your partner, or your family. There could very well be stress, fear, and anxiety present within these conversations. Does this mean you should avoid the issue at hand as you don't want to trigger these feelings? Is this conducive to a long-term relationship? I do believe as a society we need to increase our willingness to engage with these so-called, quote, negative emotions. This leads on to my next point. Progress within a society comes at the cost of offending the establishment. This can be an establishment political structure, an establishment culture, whatever. For example, we have Socrates in Athens way back in the day, Galileo and the church, Pasteur and the scientific community of the time, and of course modern speakers, such as Stefan Molyneux, Alex Jones, and others. If we cannot offend, we cannot proceed, both at the individual and societal level. We must be willing to endure pain for gain, pressure for diamonds, such and so forth. If, for example, Louis Pasteur was worried or not allowed to offend people, not allowed to cause fear, stress, anxiety in the hearts and minds of those around him, we never would have discovered the germ theory of disease. You cannot progress in a society if you're not willing to offend people. I'm sure a lot of people back in the day who were proliferating the idea that disease come from bad air or something like that. They had a lot to lose. They would have been paid well to come around and go, bad air this, bad air that, have some lavender and things like that. They had a lot to lose, reputation, fiscally, all sorts. When Louis Pasteur came along and really hammered home the germ theory of disease. So of course they would have lashed out at him. And at the time, I'm sure they were writing up articles saying, you can't do this. It offends me, And it's all just a cover for power, essentially. This is all that hate speech is. Hate speech can be one of two things. It is a way of protecting established political groups, for example, outlawing free speech so people can't criticize you and things like that, which sort of blends into the next point. It's a way to cheat in the intellectual debate. If you've lost the intellectual battle and you don't want to proceed on that level, just declare what your opponent is saying to be hateful, and a billion million rabid leftists will dogpile them into oblivion. It's intellectually dishonest, in my opinion. You should engage with the arguments regardless of how they make you feel, because feelings are subjective. What offends one person cannot offend another, and so forth, which is why hate speech can never be put into law, because it's so goddamn broad that it could never, be objectively applied. As each political party comes through the structure, they'll be arresting people for different things. Let's say, for example, the Republicans in America would be arresting people for saying Jesus is bad or whatever. I'm being very stereotypical here. And the Liberals would arrest people for criticizing Islam or something. I don't know, something like that. Hey, they're both quite theocratic. That's really interesting. So no. Of course, I reject the idea that hate speech is not free speech. What is hate speech? It's so broad. Anything. This article right now is hate speech. It's belittling Donald Trump, and it's belittling my ideas, and it's defaming racists and whatever. You see, there's just no way you can evenly apply this term. This article right now is triggering emotions of fear and distress in me. It should be banned. So yes, of course, free speech is the mechanism for communication within a civilized society. Otherwise, we'll just go back to gulagging, clubbing each other over the head with rocks, and things like that. Thanks for sticking around, guys, and have a good one.